David had always been a man of simple means. He lived in a modest, old house that had been passed down from his parents, a place filled with memories and sentimental value. Though his income was average and his car was far from luxurious, he was content with his life. He worked hard, paid his bills on time, and never caused trouble for anyone. But that wasn't enough for his wealthy neighbor Richard. Richard was the kind of man who believed that money determined a person's worth. He lived in a massive mansion next to David's small home, with luxury cars parked in his driveway and extravagant parties hosted every weekend. To him, David's presence in the neighborhood was an eyesore, a poor man surrounded by the rich. And Richard hated it. One evening, while David was watering his front lawn, Richard pulled up in his latest sports car, flashing a smug grin. "David, my friend," he called out, stepping out of his car with an air of arrogance. "I've been meaning to talk to you." David wiped the sweat off his forehead and looked up. "What's up, Richard?" Richard let out a chuckle and gestured at David's house. "Listen, you've done well for yourself, but let's be honest, this place doesn't belong in a neighborhood like this. It's old, outdated, and quite frankly, embarrassing." He sighed dramatically as if he was doing David a favor. "I'll make you an offer. Sell me this property and I'll pay you a generous sum. You can move somewhere more suitable." David frowned. "Thanks, but no thanks. This house means a lot to me. It's not about money." Richard's smile faltered for a second before he forced it back. "Oh, come on, David. You're wasting prime real estate. I could expand my estate, build a bigger guest house, maybe even a private tennis court. Think about it. What are you really holding on to?" David remained firm. "This isn't just a house, Richard. It's my home." Richard's expression darkened. The false friendliness in his eyes was replaced with irritation. "Suit yourself," he muttered. "But don't say I didn't warn you. People like you never last long in places like this." As he walked back to his car, David couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Richard's words weren't just empty threats. He had seen what money and power could do, and he had no idea that this was just the beginning of a nightmare. At first, David thought Richard would simply let it go. He assumed the arrogant businessman would move on to another project, another luxury purchase to occupy his time. But he was wrong. Richard wasn't the type to take no for an answer. When he wanted something, he got it by any means necessary. And David was about to learn just how ruthless Richard could be. The first attack came subtly. One morning, David arrived at work only to find his boss waiting for him with a grim expression. "David, I hate to do this, but we have to let you go," the man said. Avoiding eye contact, David's heart sank. "What? Why? I've been working here for years. I've done nothing wrong." His boss sighed. "Look, I'll be honest with you. There's been pressure from some influential people. I don't want trouble, and I don't want to lose my biggest client. It's out of my hands." David didn't need to ask who was behind it. Richard. The bastard had pulled strings, used his connections, and just like that, David's source of income was gone. But the war had only begun. A week later, David received a notice from the bank. His mortgage application, one that had already been pre-approved, was suddenly denied. Confused, he went to speak with the bank manager, only to be met with vague excuses and bureaucratic nonsense. "We're sorry, Mr. Lawson, but due to unforeseen circumstances, we can't proceed with your request," the banker said with a rehearsed smile. David gritted his teeth. "Unforeseen circumstances? Or did someone make a call and convince you to deny me?" The banker's smile wavered, but he didn't respond. That was answer enough. With no job and his financial safety crumbling, David had to sell his car just to cover his bills. And still Richard wasn't satisfied. The final blow came in the form of a lawsuit. Late one night, a loud crash echoed outside David's house. He rushed out to find a wrecked motorcycle lying on his lawn, a man groaning on the ground. Within minutes, police and an ambulance arrived, and before David could process what was happening, he was accused of negligence. "This man claims he crashed because your property was unsafe," an officer told him. "If we find you responsible, you could face a lawsuit." David stared in shock. He had never seen this man before, and his property had nothing hazardous. It didn't make sense until he saw Richard standing near his mansion, watching with amusement. It was a setup, a perfectly orchestrated trap. And now David was being dragged into a legal battle he could never afford to fight. That night, as he sat in his nearly empty house, staring at the lawsuit papers, David realized something. Richard wasn't just trying to buy his home. He was trying to destroy him. And if David didn't fight back soon, he would lose everything. David sat in his darkened living room. The lawsuit papers spread across the coffee table like a cruel joke. His bank had turned its back on him, his employer had abandoned him, and now he was being dragged into a fabricated legal battle. Richard had backed him into a corner, stripping away his financial security and leaving him with nothing but the walls of the home he refused to give up. But as he sat there staring at the mess his life had become, something inside him shifted. He wasn't going to let Richard win. If the man thought he could bulldoze David out of his own home, he was in for a rude awakening. Richard had money and influence. But David had something far more dangerous, nothing to lose and everything to gain, That night David stayed up, combing through every piece of information he could find on Richard. A man that powerful, that arrogant, had to have skeletons in his closet. And David was determined to drag them into the light. He spent hours researching property records, corporate filings, and old news articles. Then he reached out to former employees of Richard's company, people who had been discarded and mistreated. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Richard's wealth wasn't as stable as it seemed. He was running a fraudulent real estate scheme, securing investors for a luxury development project that didn't exist. His company was over-leveraged, drowning in hidden debt while he paraded around as a successful businessman. Even worse, he had been evading taxes for years, funneling money through offshore accounts. David knew this was his ticket to revenge. But gathering information wasn't enough, he needed allies. He reached out to an investigative journalist, someone who had been trying to expose Richard but lacked concrete evidence. David provided the missing pieces, along with the testimony of a former accountant who had seen the shady transactions firsthand. Next, he contacted financial analysts and investors, subtly dropping hints about Richard's fraudulent dealings. If they started pulling out, it would send shockwaves through the business world. And finally, he sought the help of a legal expert, someone who knew exactly how to package the evidence and present it to the authorities. With everything in place, David executed his plan with precision. He leaked the real estate fraud documents to the media on the eve of Richard's biggest investment deal, ensuring maximum impact. The next morning, headlines exploded across financial news outlets, exposing Richard as a fraud. At the same time, federal investigators received a detailed report on his tax evasion, prompting an immediate response. Within hours, investors panicked and pulled their money from Richard's projects, sending his company's stock into free fall. The final blow came when authorities raided his offices, seizing financial records and freezing his accounts. In the span of 48 hours, Richard's empire crumbled. His reputation was in ruins, his investors had abandoned him, and his once unshakable power was slipping through his fingers. As David watched the chaos unfold, he felt the tension in his chest loosen for the first time in weeks. But this wasn't over. Richard had spent months trying to crush him, and David wasn't going to let him off that easy. The final lesson was yet to come, and David was going to make sure Richard never forgot it. Richard had spent years building his empire, believing that his wealth and influence made him untouchable. But in just 48 hours, everything he had worked for unraveled before his eyes. His name was smeared across every major news outlet. Real estate mogul caught in multi-million-dollar fraud scandal. Authorities investigate shocking tax evasion scheme, each headline striking another blow to his already crumbling reputation. Investors who had once groveled at his feet were now frantically distancing themselves, yanking their funds from his projects, causing his company's stock to collapse overnight. Banks froze his accounts, creditors came knocking, and the authorities launched a full-scale investigation into his fraudulent empire. His office was raided, his home swarmed by reporters. And just like that, Richard Monroe, the once untouchable billionaire, was now a drowning man with no lifeline in sight. David watched it all unfold from the comfort of his small home. The same home Richard had once tried to take from him. Poetic justice. He could have let things end there, let karma finish what he started. But Richard had spent months trying to destroy him. And David wanted to see the man truly broken. One evening, as David sat on his porch sipping coffee, he spotted Richard standing outside his mansion, his once pristine estate now dark and lifeless. Gone were the luxury cars that had lined his driveway, repossessed by the banks. His extravagant parties had turned into desperate phone calls to lawyers and business partners, all of whom had long since abandoned him. The mighty Richard Monroe was now just a shell of the man he used to be. But David wasn't finished yet. He had one last card to play. The next morning, an auction notice was placed on Richard's mansion. His prized possession, the symbol of his wealth and power, was now up for sale to cover his massive debts. And who was the highest bidder? David. Richard stormed into the auction house, red-faced and livid, but there was nothing he could do. The same man he had mocked, humiliated, and tried to destroy now owned the home he had once looked down upon him from. When the paperwork was finalized, David made sure to deliver the final blow himself. Standing at the gates of the estate, Richard approached him, desperation evident in his eyes. "David, listen, we had our differences, but you don't need this house. I built this place from the ground up. You can have any property you want, just let me keep this one." David smirked, savoring the moment. He leaned in slightly and whispered, "I thought people like me didn't belong in neighborhoods like this." Richard's face twisted with humiliation and rage, but he had no comeback, no escape. His arrogance had brought him here. And now he had lost everything. As he turned away in defeat, David watched him go, finally free of the torment Richard had caused him. This was true justice, not just revenge, but the satisfaction of knowing that, in the end, the powerful fall just as hard as the rest of us. As Richard walked away from what was once his grand estate, his shoulders slumped in defeat, David felt a rare sense of closure settle over him. The man who had tormented him, stripped him of his job, sabotaged his finances, and tried to force him from his home had finally tasted the bitter reality of his own cruelty. But while Richard had lost everything, David was just getting started. With the mansion now legally his, David could have easily moved in, reveled in his victory, and lived in luxury, but that wasn't who he was. Instead, he had a different plan. One that would ensure Richard would never rise again. Over the next few weeks, David transformed the estate. Instead of keeping it as a symbol of revenge, he turned it into a shelter for struggling families and individuals who had been displaced by corrupt business practices, just like he had almost been. The once exclusive mansion that had only housed the elite now opened its doors to people in need. The media caught wind of the transformation, and soon headlines changed. Former victim of real estate fraud buys mansion and turns it into community shelter. The House of Greed becomes a home of hope. It didn't take long before people started mocking Richard even more. The mansion that had once been his pride and joy was now a sanctuary for the very kind of people he had looked down on. Social media exploded with memes of Richard standing outside the gates, looking in while others thrived inside. His name became synonymous with arrogance, failure, and downfall. Meanwhile, Richard's situation only got worse. The authorities were closing in on him, his former allies had abandoned him, and every attempt he made to restart his career ended in failure. No one trusted him. Even those who had once admired him now used his name as a cautionary tale of what happens when greed overtakes morality. He had once seen himself as invincible, but now he was nothing more than a disgraced man with no money, no power, and no influence. One afternoon, as David was overseeing renovations at the mansion, he spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench across the street. Richard. His clothes were no longer designer, his hair was unkempt, and for the first time, his face lacked the smug arrogance it had once held. He simply sat there, watching the mansion that had once been his, now full of life and hope, but no longer belonging to him. David walked over and stood in front of him. Richard looked up, the weight of his downfall evident in his tired eyes. "You won," Richard muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You took everything." David shook his head. "No, Richard. You lost everything. There's a difference." With that, David turned and walked back toward the mansion, leaving Richard alone with nothing but the consequences of his own actions. The world had moved on, but Richard would forever live in the shadow of the life he destroyed for himself. And that, David thought, was the greatest justice of all. Weeks passed, and life for David had never been better. The once oppressive weight of Richard's torment was gone, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose. The mansion-turned-shelter was thriving, filled with people who had once been on the verge of losing everything just like he had been. Every morning as he walked through the grand hallways that once symbolized greed and arrogance, He felt something Richard never had, fulfillment, respect, and the satisfaction of knowing he had done something meaningful, But while David had moved on, Richard hadn't. The once mighty businessman had become a ghost in his own city, drifting from one failed attempt to another. Every effort to re-establish himself ended in closed doors and rejection. No one would hire him, his name had become toxic in the business world, and even those who had once worshipped his wealth now saw him as nothing more than a cautionary tale. One rainy evening, as David was locking up the shelter for the night, he noticed a lone figure standing across the street, soaked, hunched over, staring at the building with hollow eyes. Even in the dim streetlight, he recognized the worn-down face of Richard Monroe. For a moment, David hesitated. The man who had tried to ruin him, who had nearly stripped him of everything, now stood there, broken, defeated, and utterly alone. A year ago, he would have relished this moment. But now looking at Richard, a man who had once ruled from a golden throne, now standing in the rain like a beggar, he realized something. Richard had already received his punishment. David took a deep breath, stepped off the curb and crossed the street. Richard barely reacted when David stopped in front of him. He looked thinner, weaker, not just physically, but in spirit, his once pristine suits were gone, replaced with an old, ill-fitted jacket. The cocky smirk that had once been plastered on his face had disappeared, replaced with something David had never thought he would see, regret. "I suppose you've come to rub it in," Richard muttered, his voice rough from exhaustion. David studied him for a moment before shaking his head. "No," he said simply. "I came to ask you something." Richard gave a humorless laugh. "What could you possibly want from me? You already took everything." David exhaled slowly. "Do you regret it?" Richard's eyes flickered with something. Shame? Sadness? He looked away, his jaw clenching. "Every damn day," he admitted. "I had everything. Power. Money. People who respected me. And I lost it all because I thought I was untouchable." His voice wavered. "I should have left you alone. I should have." He stopped himself, his pride still clinging to him like a last thread of dignity. David nodded, taking in the broken man before him. He had every reason to walk away, to leave Richard in the rain just as Richard had once tried to leave him in financial ruin. But that wasn't who he was. That wasn't the lesson he wanted to teach. "Come inside," David said, gesturing toward the shelter. Richard's head snapped up in disbelief. "What?" "It's warm and there's food," David said simply. "No strings attached. Just a meal and a place to sit for a while." For a long moment Richard didn't move. His pride, what was left of it, fought against the offer. But then, as the rain continued to pour, he took a shaky breath and nodded. David led him inside. That night, Richard Monroe, the man who once believed money made him untouchable, ate at a shelter inside his former mansion. Surrounded by the very people he had once looked down on, and for the first time, he finally understood what real wealth was. David had won. But more importantly, he had risen above. At the end of the day, true wealth isn't measured by money, power, or status. It's measured by the impact we leave behind. Richard Monroe spent his life believing that his fortune made him invincible, that he could step on those beneath him without consequence. But as his story proves, karma never forgets. When greed and arrogance take over, when people treat others as disposable, their downfall is only a matter of time. Meanwhile, those who stand their ground, who refuse to be crushed by injustice, often emerge stronger than before. David didn't just win, he proved that integrity and resilience will always outlast greed. This story is a powerful reminder that life has a way of balancing the scales. You might not see it immediately, but those who abuse their power will eventually face the consequences. And those who endure hardships with patience and intelligence will find their moment to rise. Justice doesn't always come in the way we expect, but it always finds its way. What do you think? Have you ever experienced a moment where life delivered karma in the most satisfying way? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you love stories about justice, revenge, and the sweet taste of karma don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another gripping story. More incredible tales are coming your way. Stay tuned. Rocket fire.